ain't see me, you Stevie. Wondering how I reach more evolutions than Eevee and make it look easy.
What is up, Earth's mightiest subscribers? It's Blerd without fear. Welcome back to the channel. Alright, so today's video, we're going to be talking about Space Ghost #1, written by David Pepose, with art by Jonathan Lau, and color by Andrew Dahlhaus. So I'm going to go ahead and put something out here. This is kind of more of a PSA for the people who are interested in this comic, but you're not really sure whether this is going to be a retelling of the original Space Ghost animated series, or the revival that came later, or if it's going to be a continuation of Space Ghost Coast to Coast, or even Space Ghost from DC Comics. I'm here to tell you what this is and what it ain't. This is not in any way, shape, form, or fashion meant to be a sequel to Space Ghost Coast to Coast, and it is not connected to the DC Comics Space Ghost at all. I will say, if you were expecting a more funny Space Ghost, you have come to the wrong comic. This is a Space Ghost that is as serious as a heart attack. And if you are someone who is looking for that DC Comics version of Space Ghost, but are disappointed that this is not a continuation, I think it would be in the vein of something that you would probably like. Now, I mentioned the original, Space Ghost animated series. I think they had like a revival later. This is more indicative of that. And what I mean by that is just that this is Space Ghost as a straight up superhero. He is a guy who fights crime across the spaceways. And at the time that we pick up at the start of the series, he is already a major name in the galaxy. Like, all the space criminals, the space pirates, they all know who he is. And while some take him more seriously than others, there's definitely a bit of mystique surrounding Space Ghost in this. The best way to describe how the super criminals of Space Ghost Rogues Gallery think of him, it's kind of like how Gotham criminals used to think about Batman before they got just a little too used to him. You know this guy is out here, and while there are some people who might think of him as a myth, or maybe even think of him as a joke, at the end of the day, everyone who encounters him believes he truly is a ghost. He's a guy who is terrifying. He pops out of the shadows. He's someone who uses the darkness as a way to hide himself because, as Batman once famously taught us, criminals are a superstitious and cowardly lot, and he uses that to his advantage, on top of a lot of the gadgetry and weapons and other abilities you would associate with Space Ghost. One thing I will say that might surprise some people, and I don't know, maybe it won't surprise some others, but one thing I thought was pretty cool about this, we get a lot more time with Jace, Jan, and Blip. And this is mostly because Space Ghost, at least in this first issue, is kept as a lot of a mystery. He's not someone who even really talks a whole heap of a lot. When we see him on panel, he is treated as though he is some mysterious space hero and is more myth and legend than actual person. But at the end of the day, he is a person. Now, he does still have a lot of the abilities you might associate with Space Ghost. He has his superhuman alien physiology, most likely still intact, though we haven't really spent enough time around him to know exactly the full extent of it. But just in the first issue alone, we see him pull off some pretty impressive feats and strike literal actual fear into the hearts of the criminals that he faces. But getting back to Jace, Jan, and Blip, the trick with them is that we're kind of getting their origin a little bit more than we're getting the origin of Space Ghost. We're spending more time with them as characters and kind of witnessing how they fall into the hands and care of Space Ghost. And it's pretty interesting because, without going too terribly deep off into it, all you really need to know is that Jace, Jan, and Blip are going to fall into the care of Space Ghost by some very tragic circumstances. And even in their meeting of Space Ghost, as I mentioned earlier, he's, kind of intended to be a guy who's like a big, scary superhero. And he is big, scary superhero, not just to criminals, but even to people like Jace, Jan, and Blip. They don't even really know what to think of him at first. And the criminals he faces, in this particular instance, Tanzit is the villain that he, goes up against the most in this. And while there definitely are some other characters I don't really want to spoil, because I feel like that's kind of half the surprise, you do see more of Space Ghost's more known rogues gallery. I feel like Tansit is one of those characters that, well, I think that you would probably recognize him from the Space Ghost animated series. Like if you were someone who was more of a Space Ghost casual, or someone who just maybe tuned into Space Ghost Coast to Coast or whatever, I would imagine Tansit is probably one of those characters you're just kind of like, he looks familiar, but I don't really recognize him. And I would not be shocked if some people just immediately assumed that it was Moltar, but no, that is Tansit we see in this. But we do see some of the other villains from Space Ghost Rogues Gallery, and the way that they're handled in this is pretty damn cool, in my opinion. The way that they're depicted, and this is one thing I've kind of talked a good bit about what David Pepos has brought to the table as far as how he's crafting the narrative. I want to say real quick, just to put some respect on the art department side of this, and that's that Jonathan Lau, who, for those who are unfamiliar, I think I became more familiar with him when he was working with Mark Waid on the Green Hornet series, also at Dynamite back like in 2013-ish. His art on this is fantastic. I love the way that he depicts his action in this, the moments where you see Space Ghost fighting against, whether it's, Tansit or any of the other villains that show up in this, is just really cool. And like seeing when Space Ghost is using his superhuman strength, and like you could literally see the muscles and everything, like just they're very well defined, and when he's straining and trying to take something head on, versus when like there's moments where someone has complete and utter shock on their face, and you almost see like it's actually one of my favorite panels from this issue, which is kind of weird considering it's not like a big action thing, but like seeing characters get the SpongeBob like super dried eye kind of look thing going on is really awesome. And the way that he plays with shadows and light in this, and even going to the colorist department on it, this is where we're kind of going more over to Andrew Dahlhouse's side of things. I love the use of red in this, because it kind of will, I don't know if it was intentional, but it will put you in the mindset of Batman the Animated Series. It was something I thought was really, really, really cool with how this was done. They kind of set it up where a lot of the scenes where if Space Ghost is hiding in the shadows, it would kind of put you in that mind frame of the intro of Batman TAS, where he's taking on the criminals on the rooftop. And I mean, it's not like exactly the same color, but it's kind of just right in there. And yeah, it's really fun. This book is just really cool. I thought it was really, really cool. And I say this as a guy who, well, I'm not like a super fan of Space Ghost by any stretch of the imagination. I grew up watching the cartoon. To be fair, it was when they kind of did like a revival of it. It used to pop up on like USA Network back when I was a kid. Like I said, I wasn't a super fan of it, but it was something that I thought was cool, and it just kind of went away. And it was one of those things that I just never really thought much about until Space Ghost Coast to Coast became a thing. Seeing this, you're being reminded that Space Ghost is that dude, that he is basically, I mean, yeah, a crude way to put it is space Batman, but if you really want to think about it, he's more of a space Superman who operates on a similar level to Batman. Like, he is a guy who's kind of like a mix. It's like a best of both worlds, a guy who is a superhero with superhuman abilities, but also at the same time has gadgetry and things of that nature too, and tends to use trickery to mess with people. It's kind of cool to see this, and David has a really good handle on this. I think, like, I know he didn't really give like an exact number of how many issues he was going to get, but I feel like he's probably going to get anywhere between 6 to 12 issues on this. Sound like it was going to be a pretty good run on this, so I'm really looking forward to what he's going to be able to do with this, just based on some of the things that he told me about in our interview, which if you haven't checked it out, you go check it out right here, and I'll have it linked at the end, or try to remember to have it linked at the end as well. But yeah, just what he said about how like he's gonna be playing with a lot of the different villains that we are accustomed to seeing with Space Ghost, and putting them under a particular light that will make you see them as not jokes. Like, and I feel like that's kind of a lot of the damage control that David has handled really well on this, is that he has done a very good job of crafting a story that is a friendly reminder that while you might be thinking of Space Ghost Coast to Coast when you think about the character, that this is a character who has some very serious origins, and even kind of, I won't necessarily say adding in any kind of a pulp element, but it definitely has that kind of vibe to it at times, which I think is pretty cool as well. But all in all, I think this is a fantastic book. Like I said, I don't really want to spoil a whole lot of it, because this is one of those, I feel like, yeah, the less you know about it going in, the better off I think you'll be with it. There's not really a whole lot of deep lore that I can provide for this, because once again, I'm not like some Space Ghost historian. When it comes to like X-Men stuff and like other like Marvel, DC comic stuff, yeah, sure. But like with Space Ghost, this is really just fun for me. I think even if you're just like a passing fan of Space Ghost, it's worth a read, if nothing else. With just one issue out, it's already telling a pretty solid story, and it makes me want to know more about how David is going to adapt Space Ghost in this situation. Like, is he gonna go with the more classic origin of the character? Are we gonna learn more about this character? Are we gonna discover that maybe there's a reason why he is so hard pressed to be open with Jace, Jan, and Blip? And more importantly, seeing that relationship between the characters, because I think that's going to be the really big selling point on this. Yeah, seeing the villains, seeing Space Ghost kick ass, that's going to be one thing, but I feel like the character studies on this is what's really going to be the thing to look for in this series. You guessed it, obligatory channel outro time. If you're not subscribed to the channel, consider doing so. Clicking that subscribe button and tapping that notification bell ensures that you get more videos just like this one, and you don't miss any of my other content that I drop throughout the week, plus my live streams every Thursday and Saturday. And if you enjoyed the video, make sure you click that like button, keep it plus ultra, and sound off in the comments.